Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about how to select a translation service provider. A lot of companies only do business in the US that we work with. So if you're only doing business in the US and everything you do is English communication, so it's English labels, English instruction for use, everything on your product is labeled in English, and you only sell to an English speaking market, translations isn't an applicable procedure or requirement for your company. But as soon as you start selling in other markets, translation becomes important. And you might not already have a procedure for translation because you've only been doing business in the US. And there isn't a place in the ISO 1345 standard that says you need a procedure for translations, but you should have one. And not only do you need a procedure and process for translating all those English instruction for use and labels into another language for each market that you're going to go into that has a different requirement for translations, but also you're going to have to select a vendor to do that unless you just happen to be fluent in all those other languages, which is extremely unlikely. So if you're going to outsource your translation, which is what most companies do and probably should do, how do you go about selecting those vendors? So, number one, there's actually a standard for this that gives you step by step how the translation process should be conducted. So that would be a good place to start. If you're looking for a reference, like how should we do this, there's a standard for this. So let me quickly share that with you. Here's a little screen capture of the first page of our translation procedure. This is SYS 52. And the first standard that we list there, the one that has orange and the @ symbol next to it, it's ISO 17100, and it's a 2015 standard. It was amended in 2017, so it's fairly up to date. It's not that old, but it actually tells you how to go about managing your translation process. So that's the standard that I would refer to. If you are looking for a vendor that's going to help you with this, if they're already certified to that standard, that's the guidelines that they're following when they develop their own process for translating their customers or clients' procedures and instructions, then that's a really good sign. They're using an international standard and they're certified to it. Now, they don't have to be certified to it. They could be compliant with it. But if they're using that standard and they're aware of that standard, that's a really good sign. So that would be a great place to start. Now, before that standard even existed, there was a 14971 standard, which is still in place. It's been in place since 2000. That's the risk management standard. And I remember and I think it was actually the first company that ever got 14971 certification. It was a translation facility. It was a company that did translations, and they used a risk-based approach to their translation, and they had a certification to risk management or 14971. And so that was a great marketing strategy for them, but it's also a good strategy in general. There are certain sections of your instruction for use that are going to be more critical than others. If there was an error in there, somebody could actually get hurt. So things like warnings, precautions, contraindications, those would be areas that you absolutely don't want to get those wrong. Maybe the step-by-step directions on how to use your device, that would be another place. So you might want to think about a risk-based approach to your translations, and prioritizing the reconciliation of translations might be something you do on those more critical sections of the documents you're translating. But how do you go about selecting a vendor that's going to do this? Do you just Google translation service and you're going to come up with a whole long list of them? Do you pick up a phone, call a friend and say, hey, do you know of anybody that would be a good company to use? That's another strategy people use. Or you might email your friend at another company and say, who did you use for your translations? These are very common ways that people go find a vendor. They search on the internet, or they call a friend, or they email a friend. There's nothing wrong with these strategies. One of the strategies that I like to use, I like to go see, do they have any YouTube videos on this topic? I tend to trust somebody that's taken the time and effort to create videos out there that explain the service that they're providing and provide a little education. It's sort of edu marketing. It's a term that's been used. That's what a lot of companies do. That's what Medical Device Academy does. We do a lot of videos that explain things. Hopefully, that will convince you that we actually know what we're talking about. We're committed to learning about the latest and greatest technologies, and we're actually going to follow what we teach you. So that's another strategy for finding vendors. But once you come up with a list of vendors, so whether you lurked on the internet, you asked a friend by phone, you asked a friend by email, or you looked on the internet for names in YouTube, that's how you come up with a short list. That is not the only step. So oftentimes you might want to request a quote from multiple vendors. So you shop around. People have this magic, go get 3 quotes. There's nothing magical about 3. It's more than 1, it's more than 2, but there's nothing magical about 3. Now, if your shortlist has 5 companies on it, is there any problem with picking up the phone and calling all 5 companies, looking at their websites, seeing if they have a request for a quote button on their website, talking to those companies, emailing those companies? There's nothing wrong with that. But I recommend contacting multiple companies, and when you talk to them, figure out what their process is so you understand it and say, does this meet the requirements of that standard? So you might want to buy a copy of that standard, see how close their process matches with the best practices in the standard. It doesn't have to be exactly what the standard says, but do they have a process? Can they explain it to you? Another strategy you might use is say, well, let's take our most important document, maybe the warnings and precautions and those contraindications in our instruction for use. We'd like to evaluate the different vendors in a real world test or contest, if you will. And let's have them each translate this one section that's the most important and compare the results from the different vendors. And then the vendor that we're happiest with after we're done, we'll have that vendor do the rest of the work on this project. That would be a strategy you could use. And people might say, you're absolutely crazy. That's going to, if you pick 3 different vendors, that's 3 times the cost. But you can take those 3 different versions, go to the final vendor that you say and say, well, we got 3 different versions here and there's some slight differences. Can you help us reconcile these? Part of the process of translating instruction for use, when you have a medical device or a drug instruction, you should have a reconciliation process. Sometimes they'll go forward translations, so translate from English into the language that you're looking for. They'll do backward translations from the language that you translated into back into English, and then they look for any kind of exceptions. So the English doesn't match. That would be an example. Or in this case, where we have 3 different vendors that, let's say, they all translated into French. If we have 3 different versions of French and the 3 different versions don't match exactly, that would be another case where we have some reconciliation that would be done. And whenever you do the reconciliation, instead of having the person that did the forward or the backward, it might be the person that's in charge of managing those vendors, or it may be a third, more experienced translator that would do the reconciliation. So you're not going to use the person that is just very quick and average skill. You're going to use a more experienced and highly skilled person to do those reconciliations. You're using a risk-based approach, having them target the hard to translate phrases or hard to translate words. You might also want to think about when I am picking a vendor, I'm not just picking the vendor, I'm also picking the people on the vendor's team that are going to do the work. A translation house doesn't work with one person that speaks French. They might work with 50 people that speak French. And they see which one's available at that particular time, and most of them will be subcontractors. That's our experience. We've actually audited some of these translation firms, and they have a whole bunch of different subcontractors that they work with. They've qualified them in general. They speak the language. They have some medical device experience of some kind. They're a nurse or they're a doctor, or they have that technical jargon down. And they're a native speaker. They're not just somebody that went to college and learned the language. They actually lived in the country and they know the language firsthand, and that's what they were raised with. Those are the best people to do the translations. But even when you have it narrowed down to people that are native speakers and know the jargon of your technical field, you still have multiple ones to choose from. One person might be more costly than the other. One person might be faster than the other. One person might have more natural language translation ability, and the other person might have more jargon in industry specific knowledge. So you have to make choices. And it's not always best to have all of one and none of the other. Sometimes having a mixture, like you translate this section, you translate this section, and then we'll have you switch roles for reconciliation. So there's a lot of options, but you want to look at the resumes for those people and have some input in the decision process, not just say, well, whoever you end up picking, that's great. Have some input, take an active role, and that's the translator that we would like to do this translation. And now that we're doing the reconciliation, we want a different person, and we want to take a little bit more active role in that because it's a more critical role and it's very focused. There are cases where companies, even the translation firms, will use automatic translation to brute force large documents to get a first pass. And then they will ask the translator, the person, the human being, to go back and fix errors. So the software will do a fairly decent job of certain things. Some companies even have their own proprietary software or database that says, for medical devices, this word going from English to French, this is the proper translation. And they're like, this is a common mistake that Google makes when it translates things. So we want to look for that error. And sometimes you just have to read through these documents and say, does this make sense? And you have to be a native speaker that understands the context in order to do that properly. So when you're selecting these vendors, there's a pre-selection process where you're trying to get your shortlist. There's a quoting process. There's the specific selection of the translator you're going to do. There's the various stages and milestones along the way where you have to make decisions. Is this something where I want more resources or less resources based on the risk and the importance of this translation? And then you might get into software tools, and you might build a database of translations so you don't have to repeat yourself when you use that word or that phrase again. You're not going to, like if you've already translated your indication for use in one document, you don't have to translate it again. You've already decided what that is. You copy and paste the translation from one document to another because you know it's your indications and it shouldn't change. So use some best practices, build a database of common phrases, warnings, precautions, indication for use, company name and address, things like that. There are certain things that should be standardized, and you want to build those up as a database over time. And there are software companies, there are translation companies that will use software that will help you do that. And so building a long-term relationship with these companies and making sure they have the capability of building up a database of software that has, this translation, we already know what that should be. And that's a common mistake that's made by automatic tools. And we won't let that happen in your case. You want to look for that. So those are some of the tools that you're going to use. At the end of the day, you're going to want to have a purchase order in place. You're going to want to have a supplier quality agreement with this company. You're going to want to have documented what the process is step by step from beginning to end of a translation process. You might want to have milestones where you have decision-making points and you review the progress of the translation rather than just cutting a PO for the whole amount of the project and letting them go. And you might also want to, from time to time, have a third party come in and audit them. And so that's one of the services that our company does. We'll audit companies, look at them from a quality standpoint, but you could also audit them from a technical standpoint. I'll audit things like sterilization. I'll audit risk management, design controls. I might audit manufacturing. But if I had something in the area of software or cybersecurity, it's been a long time since I've done coding or code reviews. I might have somebody that's much more current and knows the languages like Python or something like that, and have them do the code reviews and look at it more of a technical level. So you might have, for a translation firm, have an outside independent firm look at the translations and give it a second opinion. Is there anything that they would have done differently? Not on the whole entire document, but on a section of it that's important, on a section that might have had lots of things that needed reconciliation. Just another set of eyes. Another approach companies will use is they'll go to the distributor. Distributors in country are going to speak the language natively. They're probably going to know the context very well. They're going to know competitor products, but they're not translation experts. If you looked at somebody in your company that's in sales, it doesn't mean they have the world's best grammar and spelling and punctuation and writing skills. They're good at sales. So be careful when you use a distributor, but they might be a great way to have somebody just give you an audit of the work that was done. Is this look like it's high quality, or do you see obvious errors that were made in the translation? Mm-hmm. And so they should be able to give you a sense on that. And you might want to start with, like, what is this person's education? Mm-hmm. If this person doesn't have higher levels of education, their mm-hmm. reading and writing skills might not be as strong. If you're a technical writer, they probably have excellent writing skills. So evaluate or consider whoever's giving you an opinion, an audit of that translation service. What is their skill level too? Just like we qualify auditors for their knowledge of ISO 13485 and sterilization, you can also look at the qualifications of whoever's evaluating your translation provider in that language. So those are some ideas for selecting vendors. You can certainly use this procedure. We've outlined in this procedure, it's SYS 052 that's on our website. We've outlined the steps according to the standard. We put cross-references to the standard, and as well as for 1345. We've also got reference in here, ISO 20417, which is information provided by the manufacturer. So it tells you what you should have instructions for use. We also have the regulations for Europe, the EMDR and the IVDR. We've also got Canadian requirements, because Canada has requirements for English and French, but they also have dual language requirements whenever you have an over-the-counter product. And then we have the FDA requirements for English for labeling. So quite a bit of useful references and information in this procedure that might help you, but you probably want to go out and purchase that standard. That standard, again, is ISO 17100. And the most current amendment is 2017. And also ask around who does a good job of this. And don't just stop with the quickest one that you found. Shop around and try to find somebody that's really, really good, because this is something that's a little more sophisticated than the way they might have done it 10 years ago. There's some standardized ways, and they use software now, and they build databases, and they verify that their translators have skills not only in the language, but also in the jargon of your technical field. So I hope that helps anybody that's thinking about translating their English version of their instruction for use into another language. And keep in mind, you might have to look at more than one vendor, because let's say you want to cover all the languages in Europe. A particular vendor may only cover the major languages, and they may not have all the languages in Europe. So you might want to choose one vendor to do the first set of languages that are the most common. And then when you get into the less commonly used languages, you might have to go to another vendor that's actually in that country. So sometimes that's helpful to pick more than one vendor to get a better coverage of all your languages. One-stop shopping isn't always possible. I hope that helps everybody that's interested in translations. If you have other questions, please put them in the comments below. Or if you have a suggestion for a future topic, please put that in our suggestions. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next week, 12:30 Eastern time on our live streaming channel. Bye-bye.